We are going to talk about the urinary system in these teaching segments. And one of the first things we want to talk about always is orient ourselves to the anatomy. Major organs in the urinary system are the kidneys. Kidneys are the organs that create urine and send it via the ureters to the urinary bladder. Ureters are tubes that extend from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. The bladder is the storage unit for urine, and then urethra is the opening to the outside world. You have an incredible amount of blood flow to the kidney, and so because the kidney is, the function of the kidney is to get rid of liquid waste. And also to get rid of liquid waste, certainly monitor pH of the body, monitor water contents of the body, monitor ion contents, and also to reabsorb items out of the blood that can be reused by the body, like glucose, like ions, proteins, etc. You have a nice image of the urinary system on the left, and then an image of a kidney cross-section on the right. Functions in a little bit more detail: regulating blood composition, and this is uniquely, we're referring to at this time ions. Major ions that are regulated are sodium, chloride, and potassium. Water balance, electrolytes, and the osmolarity. So the ability for osmolarity is the in a very briefly is the capacity for the blood to actually diffuse out, or to the solutes in the blood to diffuse out into the interstitial space as it passes by every cell in the body. This is based on a concentration gradient of solutes, and that's what the kidney is doing, is regulating the amount of solutes in the blood, so that action, that the things that the blood are bringing to the cell for its use and taking away from the cell for its use will be in homeostasis. Excretion of urea, which is a byproduct of amino acid breakdown, not needed, and then uric acid, which is a byproduct of nucleic acid turnover, and then creatine from creatine phosphate breakdown, and it also disposes of excess water, if there is any, and excess ions, if there are any. So that is in equilibrium. Doesn't always get rid of excess water. Generally, again, most water gets reabsorbed. Not again, but I'm just telling you, most water gets reabsorbed. If you are to the point where you have very little water in your urine, so you're producing very little urine, that is thought of as either you're out of homeostasis or you're very dehydrated. Regulates blood volume, along with other systems. It's not the only system that does that, with the help of a hormone called renin, and we'll talk about renin later. Chemical makeup, so its pH remains within a very, very narrow, the pH of blood remains within a very, very narrow window, with the help of the fact that urine can excrete hydrogen ions. Hydrogen ions, remember, is our definition of an acid, something that's acidic, or to retain hydrogen ions. And then with the help of buffers, and buffers work throughout your body in a very local area. Affects blood pressure, and blood volume is going to affect blood pressure. Red blood cell formation, so it's looking at the blood that comes through your kidney and via the nervous system, etc. And with the hormone erythropoietin, can cause the bone marrow, so it can cause bone marrow to create formed elements, so blood production. Calcitrol is released to control calcium levels, and then activation of vitamin D. A lot of work that the urinary system does. The location of the kidneys are the posterior aspect of the body, so the dorsal wall. They're about at the level of your ribs, so T12 to L3. Right kidney is slightly lower than left. It's attached to the ureters, renal blood vessels, and nerves at the hilus. The hilus is the indentation. Sometimes the hilus is the portion on the kidney. Sometimes it's AKA of the renal pelvis. And then top each kidney is your adrenal gland, or sometimes we call that the suprarenal gland. Kidneys are surrounded by, so they don't really have very much protection, but they're surrounded by dense tissue and also adipose tissue. So you have some nice, you tend to have some nice fat pads that are surrounding the kidneys as their protection. Plus you have some good back muscles surrounding the tissue. The membrane that surrounds the kidney is called the renal capsule or renal fascia, and you have it written here. Renal capsule is the fascia that surrounds the kidneys, because the kidneys are highly vascularized, and not they do have structure, but they're kind of almost like a little bit more solid jello than you might think. And the fat is called the perirenal fat. Renal, if you haven't figured out already, is your word that we associate with kidney. It is the kidneys are retroperitoneal, so they're behind the peritoneal cavity and behind the peritoneum, so that sac that holds the digestive organs in, and this is a nice transverse section of the body. Kidney anatomy, so the unique functional units, or the unique units of the urinary system, are, you have two of them. You have two kidneys. Superficial, or so the outer region. So what we've done is a kidney, and we've cut it. We have cut it in half, so we are looking inside the kidney. And so the superficial region, so the region closer to the outside, you're seeing it as kind of gray on the left. On the right, it's more the artist rendition, so everything's kind of the same color. It tends to be lighter in color, no matter whether, it doesn't tend to be gray, don't get me wrong, this has been dyed on the left. It's lighter than the inner portion. Outer portion is called the cortex, inner portion is called the medulla. Renal cortex, renal medulla. The medulla is divided into sections, which we call pyramids, and those pyramids are sectioned off by columns, which tend to be extensions of the cortex that section off those columns. You have areas, and on the left it's shown in the yellow dyed portion. They are areas that are allowing urine to basically drop in. It's not, there isn't any muscular activity going on here. It just drops in. Basically, the nephron, which is a functional unit, is forcing it out, and it drops into a large to a small to a large space. The smaller space is called a minor calyx. Plural calyces, which is the word you see on this slide. Calyces, C-A-L-I-C-E-S. Calyx is C-A-L-Y-X. Those minor calyces merge into major calyces. Then those branches converge into the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis then becomes one with the ureter. Ureter will take that urine down into the bladder. In terms of the kidney anatomy. Blood flow to the kidney, you have a major renal artery and vein. And although the kidneys are very, very small, as I said, they're highly vascularized. They receive about a quarter of the cardiac output. Again, the kidney is looking at that blood. They don't receive it for themselves. Of course, blood flows to the kidney for its own purpose, but they're looking at that cardiac output, and this is every heartbeat, a quarter of the blood. Looking at that cardiac output and monitoring it for the various functions, pH, for blood pressure, blood volume, for whether the oxygen carrying capacity, so whether there need to be more red blood cells, and then also the osmolarity, so the solutes that are in suspension in the blood. Right and left renal artery branches into segments, so the segmental, then into the interlobar, arcuate, interlobular arteries. So you have this this direction. I would look at this particularly far to the right. I would look at it and compare the flow to a model or to an image, so that it makes sense that the renal artery gets segmented, and then you have arteries within the lobes. That's what interlobar. And then you have arcuate arteries, which you can think of as an arc. They're curved. And then interlobular arteries, even smaller, to the afferent arterioles. Afferent arterioles lead right into the glomerulus. Glomerular capillaries, that blood then flows through the glomerulus and then back out of the glomerulus via the efferent to paratubular capillaries, and then the same sequence where you have the interlobular veins, arcuate veins, interlobar veins, and then the renal vein. We talk about some of these individually so you get to know them a little bit better. It will just be understanding a little bit more about the sequence. They receive each nephron, and nephron is the functional unit of the kidney, receives one afferent, so one passageway in, arteriole, divides into the glomerulus, the capillary tufts of the glomerulus, and then reunite and form into the efferent arteriole, which then divides into the paratubular capillaries. So those are capillaries that are surrounding the tube system of the nephron, which is how it gets its name. And some of them have a specialized function called a vasa recta, particularly when we talk about what's happening in the individual sections of the nephron. The vasa recta is important with regard to reabsorbing ions. And then paratubular venule to vein to the renal vein, which exits the kidney, and then on its way back to the heart. The nerve intervention or the nerve flow to the kidneys, internervation. Sorry, I'm tongue-tied here. Is sympathetic. You don't have to think about peeing. The only thing you think about with regard to micturition or voiding is relaxing the external sphincter. Everything else about it is autonomic. Most of the nerves regulate vasomotor. Most of the nerves regulate whether arteries or arteries are going to constrict or dilate for blood flow. So we'll talk a little bit more about the nerve flow, but I want you just to know that most of it is going to be mechanical. So vasomotor, telling those arteries we have the blood the blood pressure is too low, we need to constrict. Blood pressure is too high, we need to dilate. And we'll pick this up on the next one.